SASPA for the invitation to speak to you today, which I was really pleased to do. As Peter said, a lot of what I say kind of emerged out of the monograph that some of you may have read and that you got last year. But since that time, as I was writing that book, I started to refine some of the thinking. But no doubt there'll be lots that I say, or some that I say, that some people won't agree with. And so because I think we mightn't have enough time for the table talk after, I'm going to make sure that I'm here so that people can come up and challenge anything that they think is unfair or off the planet or whatever. So, reflections on artificial intelligence and its impact on futures for Australian education. The topic of artificial intelligence, that is kind of training a machine to do tasks that simulate some or all of what the human brain can do, like recognise faces and voices or understand natural language or make recommendations and so on, is becoming a hot topic in education. But in the main, the discussion focuses on the possibilities for and the dangers of using artificial intelligence in schools for non-instructional tasks like helping to track student progress or communication with parents, for individualising lessons, smart tutors, or even having robots as teachers' assistants, for using data on students to identify issues or problems, or for teaching students the skills to create artificial intelligence, which obviously is a strong focus in the STEM area. Now, those are really important issues, and I think we need to consider the benefits, like the fact that it might help free up teachers to focus on students and pedagogy. It might relieve the workload of principals in some administrative tasks and so on. But we also need to consider some of the pitfalls, like the bias that can be embedded in algorithms, or whether or not we lose personal relationships with students, and so on. And so those are important issues, but today I want to focus on what I think is a prior question for artificial intelligence in education. What does it mean to prepare students for a world in which artificial intelligence is becoming prominent? What are the big issues we need to consider when thinking about curriculum and pedagogy? Now, to start answering those questions, I want to place artificial intelligence within the broader concept of the fourth industrial revolution, of which artificial intelligence is a key part. In 2001, the social theorist Jeremy Rifkin wrote a book called The Third Industrial Revolution, and he made the argument that in each of these big revolutions, there are massive changes around three broad areas: communication, energy and transport. Now, obviously, the first, second and third industrial revolutions aren't discrete. They flow in and bleed across each other and so on. But broadly speaking, when you step back, you can see these massive changes. So in the first industrial revolution, you had with communication the telegraph. For energy, coal and steam. For transport, the steam engine and so on. The second industrial revolution, communication, you had electricity, phone, radio, energy from oil, transport, the internal combustion engine. And the third industrial revolution, communication via the internet, energy via sustainable or renewable energy, and transport being increasingly autonomous. Now, Rifkin argues that we're still in the third industrial revolution, but there are a number of people who are arguing now, like Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum, who argues that we're actually entering a fourth industrial revolution, which is different from the third. Yes, it's based in the digital revolution of the third industrial revolution, but there's two major differences. First of all, it's speeding things up quite incredibly. And I mean, once quantum computing is really cracked, then that's an entirely new ballgame, but it's not there yet. But it's speeding things up, and we're getting things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, the Internet of Things, nanotechnology, gene editing, drones and robots, virtual reality, and so on. So one is the speed of what's happening, but the second difference, and I think this is really important, is convergence. That is that there's increasingly a fusing of the physical and the digital and the biological worlds. There's a blurring of information technology and biotechnology. Yuval Harari, who's an Israeli scholar, writes about it. I'll just read a short section from it, which I think summarises that important point. The AI revolution is not just about computers getting faster and smarter. It's fuelled by breakthroughs in the life sciences and the social sciences as well. The better we understand the biochemical mechanisms that underpin human emotions, desires and choices, the better computers can become in analysing human behaviour, predicting human decisions and replacing human drivers, bankers and lawyers. In the last few decades, research in areas such as neuroscience and behavioural economics allowed scientists to hack humans, and in particular to gain a much better understanding of how humans make decisions. It turned out that our choices of everything from food to mates results not from some mysterious free will, but rather from billions of neurons calculating probabilities within a split second. Vaunted human intuition is in reality pattern recognition, which comes from the biochemical algorithms of the human brain. Now he goes on to say that if these emotions and desires are in fact no more than biochemical algorithms, then there's no reason why computers can't decipher these algorithms and do so far better than Homo sapiens. And so he says, AI not only stands poised to hack humans and outperform them in what were hitherto uniquely human skills, it also enjoys uniquely non-human abilities, which make the difference between an AI and a human worker one of kind rather than merely of degree. Two particularly important non-human abilities that AI possesses are connectivity. So rather than individuals just being able to connect with one another and so on, through AI you can connect across the world immediately, every machine. And updatability, any new knowledge can immediately be connected into a new algorithm. And I just read that bit because I think it just gives a little sense of what we're on the cusp of. Because those developments have short, medium and long-term consequences. The speed of change will depend, of course, on the speed of developments in the technology. But Professor Toby Walsh, who's talking to you tomorrow, and I bet you're really looking forward to that, he's great in this area. He surveyed artificial intelligence researchers around the world to find that 50% believe that by 2062, so up to 2062 there were less than 50%, but by 2062, 50% of artificial intelligence researchers, as the people that are really at the cutting edge of these developments, say that artificial intelligence will supersede human intelligence. And that by the end of the century, most artificial intelligence researchers think that will be the case. So 2062, just over 40 years away. Again, you don't have to make the point about the kids entering school today being about 50. It seemed to me in my reading there are at least three possibilities in the longer term. And there's multiple possibilities, but I tried to think, three kind of utopian or dystopian possibilities. One is that the digital world we can use to augment and enrich our lives. We can actually really use it to enrich the way in which human beings organise society and live. A second is that just as Homo sapiens superseded and destroyed Neanderthals and Homo erectus about 50,000 years ago because we had the capability for language and writing and collaboration, so artificial intelligence may cause us to evolve into a new species. Toby Walsh actually calls it Homo digitalis. Yuval Harari, who I read from, talks about Homo deus, which I'll mention in a minute. And we evolve into this new species, this theory goes, as we surrender our decision-making to machines, we use new technologies to develop superhuman capacities, we park our consciousness in the virtual reality and the digital world, and so on. And this emerging species will blitz Homo sapiens with capabilities which are faster, store more data, can work 24/7, live longer, and so on. Yuval Harari argues, he uses the term Homo Deus as godlike humans. He says one of the dangers is that there'll be the certain elites in our society that develop these really high capacities far beyond what we can currently do as humans, while the rest of us are kind of drones trailing along in their wake. So there's a second one, that we evolve into a different species. A third, that we surrender to machines, the old sci-fi dystopia. Machines which have superior intelligence and strength and take over our world, and you've all read about killer robots and so on. The important point is that, I'm talking about the long term, but 50, 60, 70 years' time, that the future is not set. Each of those scenarios and others is possible. So the stakes are really high. And I think we need to identify now the issues, the dilemmas and the challenges and decide how we want to respond. Particularly, I think we need to identify and hold on to those human qualities that we don't want to lose. And for me, the absolute key, the only way in which we're going to be able to shape the future in a way which is going to be productive for all humans and for our environment is through education. That is, education is the key. So, having made that sort of brief introduction, what's been the educational policy response to those kinds of challenges over the past 30 years? Well, obviously there's multiple discourses in education, but I think in that monograph I made the argument there seem to be two major kind of discourses. The first is what I called a standardising discourse, which is emerged out of neoliberal ideology, which for the past 30 to 40 years has shaped our economic policies. That is, its assumptions and values have been broadly accepted by both major political parties. And over that 30 to 40 year period, neoliberalism across the world, certainly in developed countries, has been applied to various areas of social policy. And in education, its main tenets, its strategies and its effects include school choice, competition between schools, standardised testing regimes, because you need data for customers, narrowing the range of subjects taught and valued through accountability mechanisms, a focus on direct and explicit instruction as the sole means of teaching, introducing corporate sector practices to education, marginalising the voices of educators in policy development, and so on. Now, this standardising discourse isn't just, as I said, in Australia. I mean, Pasi Sahlberg, the Finnish educator who now lives in Australia, a few years back called it GERM, Global Education Reform Movement, which he said has affected a number of countries around the world. But it's been picked up by policymakers and it plays out in different ways in different countries. And in Australia, it's played out in a particular way. At the same time as that standardising discourse is around, there are many in education, and we heard some examples from the Minister just then, where educators are using what I'd call a futures-focused discourse, and things like personalised and student-centred learning and project-based learning, inquiry pedagogies, general capabilities, flipped classrooms, blended learning, virtual reality and so on are being used in a range of schools across the country. There's no doubt about that. But the point is that sometimes the same people use both discourses. I think the OECD that runs PISA has some quite progressive documents about the future in education. But at the same time, they run a standardising testing regime, which I think is quite counterproductive to good education. So the standardising discourse, I think, could be summed up as saying it's based on certainty and it prizes uniformity, competition, quantification and conformity. And the futures-focused discourse, I think, recognises uncertainty and prizes flexibility, adaptability, collaboration and agility. But although they're both there, it seems to me that, first of all, they're contradictory one to the other. And the problem is that the standardising discourse continues to cause damage to our education system and makes it far more difficult to put in place the kind of futures-focused discourse that I'm going to argue is necessary to meet the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution. The kind of damage, if you look at strategies like school choice and markets and competition and so on, have produced, and this is the amazing thing, that this has happened over the last 30 to 40 years, and don't forget, every time the results come out from PISA and these places and it shows some decline in the country's performance, the argument from those that are pushing the standardising agenda is not, oh, gee, we better do something different. Even using their own data from PISA, they say, we've got to do more of the same. And I think it's produced inequitable education outcomes. We know that the gap between educationally advantaged and disadvantaged students in terms of educational outcomes is growing. It's produced inequitable resourcing. I don't know if any of you saw the ABC research that was published just yesterday or the day before, showing the huge disparity in the billions of dollars that are spent in independent and Catholic schools as against public schools. I think in the last 4 years, $22 billion has been spent on capital projects, and half of that, that is 11 billion, has been spent on 9% of schools, all of which are in the independent and Catholic sector. There's quite clearly unfair and inequitable resourcing, and if you haven't seen that research, I urge you to go to the ABC website, not now, and check it out. And another result has been the stratification of our schooling system. Now that the OECD actually has produced evidence to show that we're about the third or fourth most stratified schooling system in Australia, stratified by socio-economic status, by culture, and so on. And finally, it's actually caused the residualisation of public education, where the discourse around education in the public sphere seems to be more, rather than public education as the primary offering that everyone should have, out of which you opt for particular reasons. It's now that it's a safety net for those that can't afford private education. So it's done some damage in that area, but the one I want to focus on today is the kind of standardising, that part of the standardising discourse which is around standardising testing and so on, which I think has, and lots of research demonstrates, has narrowed the curriculum, or certainly has narrowed what is valued in the curriculum, has impoverished views of educational accountability, so it's very narrow measures that are used to say what are good educational outcomes, rather than very broad and rich measures. And I think it's deprofessionalised educators. Over the last few years, more and more educators have been pushed to the margins of decision making, and people, economists, journalists, people from the corporate sector are those that are making a lot of the decisions about education. So together, if you take all of those things and you think about the quote I used from Yuval Harari and some of the things I mentioned about the blurring of information and biotechnology, together those, I think the standardising discourse is failing to meet the changing demands of the future. So that's my first major point. And you might want to challenge me on that. So but that's key to what I'm going to say next. So the next question is, why is the standardising agenda so dominant, and what can be done about it? Well, I think it's because the standardising discourse has a coherent narrative which embodies a set of core assumptions and values which drive improvement, like it's about the individual, it's about the market, it's about competition, it's about quantification. And these kinds of ideas have become so normalised that they're now accepted without demur. By contrast, the future-focused agenda lacks a coherent narrative beyond a desire to ensure that education meets the challenges of the 21st century. That is, we're trying these future-focused things, but it's not attaching itself to mainstream policy because I think we lack a coherent narrative about it. And in the absence of such a narrative, education debate and policy development is conducted within the broad parameters of the standardising discourse. So my second key point is, how do we shift this? Because there are shifts around the place. We shift it by establishing a new educational narrative. Now that's got to be more than, say, getting rid of NAPLAN or modifying NAPLAN, because unless you change the narrative and its core beliefs and assumptions, then just something else will grow up in its place, something just as toxic. So what are the elements of a new educational narrative? Well, the first thing I did was have a look at some of the literature around on what should happen in education. And I thought that there were four broad areas, ways that people thought about the future. The first was, some people argue that we need to revert. That is, we need to adopt strategies which reinstate key features of the past. That is, there was a golden educational age and we need to go back to it. The second group talk about reboot. They say education is going okay, we've set it up okay, but we just need to do some things better. So we focus on teaching, and we work out what are the things that teachers aren't doing well, and we try and reboot that. The third group of literature is about reframing. They're strategies which depart radically from the past by making significant changes to curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, school organisation and culture. And you know, things like big picture schools or new teaching approaches, new digital technologies, general capabilities. These have all been attempts to move beyond the traditional approach to education and reframe it. And the fourth lot was around, I could replace, so it's the 4 R's. By using the promise of new technologies, schools will become obsolescent and teachers either redundant or needed less, and there's a body of literature around that. So when I looked at those four kind of broad areas, what I came up with eventually, I think, took a little bit from the first three, not the replace, but I did notice that there was one common absence, and it was the absence of a mention of purposes. Now, I think that purposes are the bedrock of our education system. It's why we're engaged in the activities in which we're engaged. Unless we really understand as a profession what the purposes of education are, setting goals is a hit and miss affair. There's no criteria against which to judge if goals are fit for purpose and so on. Now, before you say, oh, we've heard that before and yeah, we have got purpose, think of the Melbourne Goals of Schooling. The Melbourne Goals of Schooling actually doesn't contain purposes. It's goals. This is where we want to go. Goals tell us this is what we want to do. Purposes tell us why. And I personally made a submission to the group that's looking at the Melbourne Goals of Schooling and made the argument we really need to come to grips with what the purposes of education are. So for me, when you think about the new educational narrative, the first component is purposes. So I then thought, okay, you actually need to ground those. And so in my submission to the Goals of Schooling, I argued there were, to the Melbourne Goals of Schooling, I argued that there were 4 purposes that we need to take account of. The first is a democratic purpose. That is, we're preparing young people for democratic life, locally, nationally, regionally and globally. The second is an economic purpose. We're preparing young people for the labour market, for work. The third is an individual purpose. We're sort of trying to develop young people to the fullest of their potential. And the fourth is a social and cultural purpose. We're trying to develop young people that can work in social and cultural communities in very productive ways. What you need in each of those areas, democratic, economic, individual and social and cultural, are capacities to be able to operate in those areas. Okay, Rowan Connell, she calls them capacities for social practice. Now, when you think about that, what's the impact of those purposes? Well, the first is it makes clear that equity is central, because you can't provide education unequally on the basis of wealth or birth if those areas have to be addressed in any contemporary society for the future. So I think it makes the case for equity. The second is that all those purposes are important. again seems obvious, but in fact I'd make the argument if you look at policy and policy documents for the last 20 years, the major purpose has been an economic one. It's been about preparing young people for the job market, and those other purposes have been pushed to the background. But most importantly for this presentation, the curriculum and culture of schools, I think, need to embody the purposes of education. And that means that as a professional community, we need to flesh out the purposes of education through professional dialogue. For example, it's not good enough to say we prepare people for democracy, when democracy can be anything from voting every 3 years through to playing a really participatory role in civil society. And that you'd need very different kinds of skills and dispositions. So we actually need to tease out what it is those purposes mean. Okay, so that's the first element of a new educational narrative, is purposes. The second element are principles and values, which, if purposes are the bedrock, I think principles and values are the soil out of which strategies and policies grow. And I think purposes must be informed by a set of agreed principles, values and assumptions. If we're actually going to move from a neoliberal narrative, it involves shifting values and principles. So I'd think values such as equity, care, compassion, empathy, collaboration, community, generosity are very different from some of the values that underpin neoliberalism, which are individualism, materialism, competition and self-advancement. So I think values are really important, and I'll talk later about the importance of saying how do we actually embed this in education systems and in our educational institutions. And secondly, we need principles which kind of work from the purposes and the values and are the guiding kind of lights by which we make decisions. And I'm thinking here, I can't go through these, but I'm thinking here, if you had a principle, it's a commitment to a broad and comprehensive curriculum, and you said, now, all policy has to take notice of that principle, and if it works against it, then it's not a policy that we want. Or a principle like approaches to accountability have to span the breadth of activities which make up, thanks mate, a rich educational experience. Or we need to recognise and trust the voice of educators in the development of education policy and the professional knowledge and skill they bring to education, to decision-making and practice. So principles and values would be the second element, and I think those purposes, principles and values, could be set within a document like the Melbourne Goals of Schooling when it's revamped. But the next thing would be to say, and how do we ensure that policymakers, as well as practitioners, work to ensure that those purposes, those principles and values are embedded in our practice. So that's the second. And the third, and this will be the major part of what I'm going to say, the third element of a new narrative is the development and use of a process which enables education policy and practice to keep abreast of the speed of change. Now, by that, if you think about the changes I talked about before, and then you think about the old model of stop-start curriculum development, where every 5, 7, 10 years we develop a new curriculum. It might be in consultation with educators, it might only be desultory consultation, and then we roll it out and then people get professional development, we put it in place. I'd argue that given the speed of change in the contemporary world, that is no longer appropriate as a way to develop curriculum. And for me, a new approach which would bring educators back to centre stage would be if educators regularly analysed and discussed the main developments and trends in society which impinge on each of the purposes and decide what these mean for the work of schools. Now, before you say that's impractical, just let me explain it first, and then you can tell me whether or not it's totally impractical. Because what I'm arguing for is a process which enables educators and policymakers in an ongoing way to understand, monitor, evaluate and assess broad societal trends and the changes that they're bringing. In other words, if we say our purposes are democratic, economic, individual and social and cultural, we've got to actually know what's happening in each of those arenas, don't we? And given that change is happening so quickly, it seems to me that it's incumbent upon us to understand what's happening to democracy as a result of some of these key societal trends. What's happening to work as a result of some of these key societal trends, okay? And I'm thinking here of big societal trends like climate change or environmental degradation or globalisation and its consequences or inequality within and between nations or threats to democracy, you know, really big questions. Now, and I'm going to use the fourth industrial revolution as my case study of a big trend and have a look at what implications it has for schools and curriculum. So where would this happen? Where would you look at these big issues? Well, I'm arguing, and again, you can tell me whether I'm off with the fairies after, I'm arguing it could happen at the school level, it could happen at a partnership level, it could in fact happen at a system level. That's where it would best be happening, because resources could be put in to support it. And the benefits of an ongoing, I'm thinking that, say, every 12 months, 18 months, every 2 years, you'd pick a major societal trend. And the focus would be on understanding the trend, first of all, and its impact, and its consequences for the social capacities that people need, and then asking the question, what does that mean for what we're teaching? Do we have to change this and this? Do we have to tweak this here? Do we have to drop this out? Do we need to add something else in? I'm hoping that at least the argument is clear, even if you don't agree with me. So what I'm saying is we need, the new process could be a process where your partnership, so let's take your partnership example, and you've taken the fourth industrial revolution. And here's your first, you've got a partnership day, professional development day, and you're going to work through a process. Because I proposed a 6-step process that I'll take you through, but there's any number of ways that you could do this. But mine was that you spend the first 3 steps only focusing on the issue, right? So you spend maybe 6 months, 8 months, 10 months focusing on the fourth industrial revolution, if that's your issue. Every time people start talking about the educational implications, you say, no, let's jot that down and remember it. We won't touch it yet. We want to understand the issue. And the second 3 steps are saying, okay, given we now know what the issue is and what impact it's having and the kinds of skills and capacities people need, now we need to ask, what are the curriculum implications? What are the pedagogical implications? What does it mean for culture in schools and systems that we need to promote? And what are the blockages that we need to get rid of? So what I'm proposing there is that, and I'll now give it a go and see if using this fourth industrial revolution as an example. So I'm proposing this 6-step process. You can see that at the top there's educational purposes, principles and values. You've got those embedded. Now your steps 1 to 3, which might be a year, you're exploring a key societal trend, its impact and its consequences. And step 4, we're looking at what are the implications for curriculum and pedagogy. Step 5, what are the blockages to change? And step 6, what cultures will enable change? Now, you're in your partnership. Now, I'm going to suggest that there's going to be a number of benefits that come out of this. First will be that at the end of this process, you can decide together the kinds of changes that you need to make and the kind of resources that you might want to ask the department to assist you with. Secondly, it's educators that are involved in this discussion, and I think that would have a flow on to teaching. I mean, just actually taking each of these issues and looking at them in a range of ways is going to have a flow on to teaching, I think, and would involve, I'm hoping, at the school level, parents and students as well. So it'd be knowledge for teaching, and it would assist educators participating in public debates about these particular issues. So I'm going to try going through it, and just before I do, I want to just summarise my argument, because that's the first major bit of the talk. I'm arguing that to break the stranglehold of the standardising agenda, we need a new and powerful educational narrative which is based on agreement about 3 key elements: purposes of education, principles and values, and a process for understanding the challenges of the world for which we're preparing children and young people, and for deciding on the educational approaches which will best meet them. you've decided in your partnership that you're going to look at the fourth industrial revolution, and the first day, professional development day, you're dealing with this question, which is step one: what is the fourth industrial revolution? So you're just trying to get to a common understanding about what it is. And you get people in, you've got films, you get people like Toby Walsh talking and so on. And so at the end of the time, you might come up with a statement. I've just got a statement from Schwab. Previous industrial revolutions liberated humankind from animal power, made mass production possible, brought digital capabilities to billions of people. This fourth industrial revolution is fundamentally different. It's characterised by a range of new technologies that are fusing the physical, digital and biological worlds, impacting all disciplines, economies and industries, and even challenging ideas about what it means to be human. But you've broadly explored it in step one. Now, step two, in my model, is what are the implications of, in this case, the fourth industrial revolution. And what I'm going to just ask you to do, if you can, I'm going to go through each of those four areas: the economy, democracy, individuals, and social and cultural life, okay? And if you can, we're now truncating it, because this section is what would take you most time. So you've now, back in your school, people are coming along saying, oh, did you see this? There's this resource. How about looking at this? There's a new book come out, right? You're sharing it. You might be spending a bit of time in your staff meeting each time, sharing ideas and so on, okay? So it's what are the implications of the fourth industrial revolution? If you can just jot down, as I go through, what I think some of the implications are very quickly. I'm truncating, say, a year's work into 10 minutes. If you can just jot down what implications you think it has for the skills, don't do it education yet. What are implications of the skills or knowledge or understandings that people will need to cope with these sorts of trends, okay? So let's take the first one. The emergence of the fourth industrial revolution has implications for the economy. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on this because I think Toby Walsh tomorrow will do a fair bit on this. But we know that automation has already taken the place of workers in routine manual jobs, assembly line workers and labourers and so on, and routine cognitive jobs like clerks and office work assistants and so on. And at the moment they're being replaced by non-routine manual and cognitive work. And the level of employment actually in this country is at the moment stable. But will it continue? Now, in the short and medium term, there are all sorts of debates about that. Some people say, no, the robots taking our jobs is overhyped, and old jobs will always be replaced by new jobs. So people obviously need to be flexible and adaptable and learn quickly. But in fact, work isn't threatened; it'll just be different work. And some people say, no, the nature of work's going to change. It's not just new jobs, but as AI takes some tasks, there'll be a greater focus on human skills and human capacities. It'll remove a lot of the drudgery of work. And it means people will have to be more analytical and critical and creative and interpersonal. You need those interpersonal skills, and curious and so on. And there are some that say, no, there's actually going to be, even in the medium term, significant job losses. There was one major study in the United States that said there's going to be 47% of jobs which are under threat of automation in the next 2 decades. At first it'll be unskilled workers, but then it'll become non-routine cognitive workers that lose their jobs. But in addition, as technology increases productivity, if some jobs are retained, you'll need fewer people anyway. So that group, and we're talking about short and medium term, they're in the argument that no, we're actually in the game now of losing jobs. This is even at a time when you all know, and the Minister was talking about vocational education, that there are still skills in lots of areas of the second industrial revolution. So it's really quite a complex an area. In addition, we've got work changing, like with the gig economy, more casualised work, people working fewer hours, and people working for multiple employers. So you ever think about, just jot down, if one of those scenarios plays out, what are the kinds of capacities that we'll need to develop in young people? In the long term, it's an even bigger question, and don't forget I was arguing the long term might be 50 or 60 years according to people like Toby Walsh. In the lifetime of our students, that some say, well, machines may be better, but what we'll do as humans is work out that we want to retain some human skills and social interaction. So we're actually going to protect some of the things that we've got. And even though machines might be able to do it, more productively, we're not going to let them do that. But some say no, the logic of capitalism is such that it will drive the fact that we're going to have to lose jobs. And there's an argument around about the universal basic wage. And some say, well, the hours that we work are going to decrease and decrease and decrease. If as a society we play this properly, this could be a new utopia. I mean, this could be a time when we could do volunteer work, we'd do a bit of paid work, we'd pursue our recreation and so on, which has some implications for schools on its own. Some people say, and we'll be paid by this universal basic wage. We'll work out that it's a new society and we'll all get paid from the work that these machines are doing for us. But others say, no, that's not going to happen because, like climate change, we'll be too slow to act, and it'll be the elites that maintain power and get all of the goodies, and there'll be a kind of large useless class, Yuval Harari calls them, where there's kind of social disruption and so on. Now, here's my question. What does that all mean for the economy? That is, changes in the nature, the type and extent of work. But importantly for us at this stage, in the next step, we're going to say, what does that mean for the kind of capacities you need? The second one is individuals, and I'll just cover this quickly because I'm running out of time. First of all, although there's a lot of good things that come out of social media and use of the internet and so on, some of these quite negative effects. One is the data and privacy that we've lost. Some refer to as surveillance capitalism, where data is monetised and we no longer actually have secrets because the data is being used in a whole range of ways to make money for people. Then there's the negative effects of social media. A lot of research showing that the use of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and so on actually makes people feel more socially isolated. It actually reduces social interaction. It creates a situation where people unfavourably compare their lives with others who are busy on their Facebook branding and curating their self-image. It's led to trolling and cyberbullying. And it's diminished our skills, our human skills. I mean, technology, as you know, is increasingly making decisions for us. And some people argue that instead of programming computers, they're starting to program us. Harari calls it dataism, that is taking the place of our human instincts for decision making. So there's some impacts at the social level on individuals, which has implications for your capacities. At the social and cultural level, have a think about the impact on multicultural cohesion through things like what's being shown now, that many of the algorithms actually embed racial and gender biases. Because the algorithms are devised by humans at this stage, they're actually embedding in all the biases that we have. Or if unemployment is going to increase and we don't do anything about it, we can see already that what's that doing is causing social disruption as groups who are without work in some of the unskilled work areas are starting to blame people from overseas and refugees and so on. And I think there's quite a strong theory about the rise of Trump and Hanson and so on comes through that kind of thinking. And the fourth, so there's individuals' impact on such aspects as privacy, social isolation, self-esteem, trolling and cyberbullying and so on, and there's social and cultural life. The one I just want to spend a little bit of time on is the one on democracy, because I think that's crucial. And democracy, there are such impacts on key aspects of our democratic life that we must take account of them, and we must develop a populace can actually has the skills to work against some of these things, like interventions into elections by other countries. I mean, being aware of that, and you know what happened with Russia's intervention into the US elections as an attempt to elect one candidate as against another, and to increase social and political discord in a particular country. You've got, and this is an important one, a manipulation of voters through hyper-targeting and a fanning of individual self-interest rather than the common good. Now, with algorithms having the capacity to work out, now, Chris Dolan, I know exactly what you like and don't like, and I'm going to now appeal to you. Our party will do this. But Jane Heath, we know you're different, and there's a different message for you. Actually hyper-targeting individuals, which inevitably, given that it's all about individual self-interest, leads to this kind of more selfish society, rather than these are our problems and we need to try to address these for the common good, for all of us. There's the fragmentation of spaces for public discussion and 24/7 news cycles, whereas 20 years ago we all basically saw the same TV and read the same newspapers. Now it's unlikely that any of us read the same things this morning. The thousands of different feeds that come in on a regular basis. And that is obviously changing the nature of public discourse, but I think an important one is the 24/7 cycle. An important issue gets going. There's Twitter and all sorts of things go viral. Within a day, there's a new issue comes on board. And we haven't got time as a society to really go deep, to look deeply about some of these big issues. I think that's important. Another one is that we're building ourselves into silos of sameness, where there are echo chambers of bias confirmation. We're talking to one another and people we agree with rather than across divides. And for me, a really important one is the lack of civility and respect in community discussion. You just know that the internet is just filled with hate speech, and people don't seem to have got the capacity anymore to really understand other points of view and to discuss issues and problems and concerns in a civil and respectful way. There's fake news. Just the capacity to understanding what I'm reading is right, is true. And there's deep fake, where you don't actually know if the person that you're seeing on YouTube is actually that person. There's metadata and surveillance, and there's spaces for public discussion in private hands. When you think about the fact that all of our discourse now occurs through Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook and Microsoft. They're all private companies. They're all looking to make a profit. They cross national borders, okay? What incentives have they got to develop in such a way that it's going to be for the common good rather than the good of the company? So all of those things combined mean that democracy is facing a number of challenges. Some of you may have seen AC Grayling on a Q&A the other night. He's just written a book called The Crisis in Democracy. But many people are writing about the challenges to democracy and democratic life as a result of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Freedom House publishes once a year a list of countries and their political rights and civil liberties. And last year, there was 113 countries in which there was a net decline in political rights and civil liberties. And people like Kenneth Haynes, that did the Royal Commission on Banking, warned last week about the loss of trust in public institutions and why we're turning to. Now, I've done all that to say, okay, what are the skills that young people need? Now, I was going to ask you to do this, but I've run out of time. So here's what I came up with, the kind of capacities for democracy. This is just one of those areas, okay? Democracy. I thought, well, you need knowledge about democratic life. So you need an understanding and commitment to democratic institutions and processes which sustain democratic life at the local, national, regional, global level. That's a kind of a knowledge thing, which we do, which is in the curriculum, okay? But the reason that we need to take that seriously is because we need to know what's in danger, okay, what our democratic life is, what we want to change about it, and what's in danger, what we want to protect. So there needs to be knowledge about democratic life. There needs to be skills for civic and political engagement, right, coming out of what I was arguing, like skills of scepticism and discernment. Young people be able to read news and say, I need to triangulate that, I need to check whether that's a genuine source. Is that overclaiming? Are those facts correct? Being discerning about it. Now, again, I think that's probably in the curriculum, but what you do at the end of this is say, a question like, how are we addressing that across the school? How is that particular school being addressed? Is it sufficient? Or skills and commitment needed to engage in respectful discussion across different groups. And that one's fundamental. I mean, if we're going to address that problem of, hate speech and so on, then young people coming out of our schools need to have a respect for civil and respectful discussion and a respect for other points of view, and obviously local and global thinking. And then there are dispositions, and I'd argue that we need to develop in young people a commitment to the common good and not just their own self-interest, and computational ethics, and compassion and care and empathy. Those are the sorts of capacities that fell out for me when I looked at what impact is the fourth industrial revolution having on democracy. It's having those kinds of impacts. People will need these sorts of skills. So after you've done that, right, for, let's say, your 8 months, you've had quite a lot of interesting discussions and debates and so on, you're now moving into education, and you're moving on to what I've had anyway, the fourth step, which is what are the implications for curriculum? Now, I want you to imagine that you've gathered together all of those capacities from democracy, work, individual, social, right? You've got them all listed down because you've been putting them up on the side of the board in the staff room. They're all down there, and now you're going to try and make some sense out of them. And as you try and make some sense out of them, you can make checks about the extent to which we're covering that already, or the extent to which we need to do something. You'll be talking across learning areas, which is a really important benefit, I think. And so there might be some learning areas where particular things are done well, but others where they say, well, actually, we could do this in a different way as well. And so slowly you modify. Do you see, I'm arguing you try and modify things. That's what you do, I think, at the school level. I'm going to just, in the completion of the talk, say for you, when I did that with the fourth industrial revolution, this is what came up for me at the system-wide level in our curriculum. Because the first question I asked is, have we got the big components of curriculum right? And I thought, broadly, we have, because I thought that when I did all the capacities, I thought, well, if you looked at the capacities, there's 4 kinds of learning represented in them. The first is disciplinary learning, which are represented by the learning areas. The second is interdisciplinary learning, and I know that goes on in schools, but I think that is particularly underdone by ACARA. I think ACARA needs to assist teachers to make decisions about where interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary learning can be used, and to provide resources to assist in that, because it's a difficult but very rewarding process. But interdisciplinary learning, but that's there. Third is the general capabilities that we've got. That is those broad skills and dispositions that everybody needs. What you do with my list, I'd be making the case at the system level. I don't think we adequately cover scepticism and discernment. And someone might say, well, it's in metacognition, in critical thinking of the general capabilities, and we'd have a debate about that. But if we didn't cover it, maybe scepticism and discernment has to be in there, and maybe one has to be dropped out. But anyway, the general capabilities are there. But there was a fourth area that I think isn't in the Australian curriculum, certainly not to any great degree. And it's what I've called meta-learning. That is, when I looked at all these capacities and I saw that there was one thing that came up all the time was what we have been calling learning to learn. Learning how to learn, learning about learning. That if we're in a learning society, if knowledge is changing so quickly, then we've actually got to have the capacity to learn about our learning. And I thought it's so important now that I thought of meta-learning, and I thought, what would happen if you pulled together, if there was a framework which pulled together everything we know about cognitive psychology, about neuroscience, because there's big developments in that now. 5 minutes, right. Emotional or social learning, learning and physical movement, and so on. So for me, the big curriculum was general capabilities, disciplinary learning, interdisciplinary learning, and meta-learning. And then, for teaching, I looked at the fact that, now again, this seems to be the bleeding obvious, but I'd argue that in fact this is not how it's talked about in policy circles, that educators need to be able to draw from a toolkit of teaching approaches which span a range of approaches to learning. There's no one best approach. That you think of a continuum from student-centred to teacher-centred, and teachers need to be moving backwards and forwards depending on the topic, the context, the learners, and so on. So those that say this is the only way to teach, this is the only way to learn, in my view, are wrong. We need to enable teachers to adapt their teaching to suit different contexts, topics and student needs, and we need to have a solid research base for what it is we decide on. So there needs to be discussion about pedagogy, and because I've only got 3 minutes left, I'm going to do this very quickly. Because I think importantly, whilst you can look at what some of the changes needed are, there are blockages that always get in the way. Here's one. The binary of disciplinary and interdisciplinary learning. People always say, my bête noire, Kevin Donnelly, is always saying, yeah, interdisciplinary learning, it's Mickey Mouse, because disciplinary learning is all important. And they'll say, you can't have interdisciplinary learning without disciplinary learning. The two are symbiotic relationship. We've got to clear this notion that there's one or the other. The second is the undeveloped understandings about the nature, role and purpose of the general capabilities. Again, it's not a binary, it's not one or the other. You develop the capabilities through the learning areas. You need to, I think we need to understand the meaning of each capability and hold them together, not split them up into thousands of little pieces, as Akara has done, and then expect that people will piece them all together, but hold them together and develop them at increasing levels of sophistication. And I'm just going to, given I've run out of time, what are some blockages to pedagogical change? Here's a big one. The dominant tendency to view teaching approaches as a choice between explicit and inquiry learning. Now, this is a big one. It's a lack of understanding of what inquiry is, first of all, which started as a scientific kind of method, but moved over the 70s and 80s and 90s to being inductive inquiry, deductive inquiry, discovery learning, problem solving. It can be teacher-guided inquiry or it can be student-led inquiry. There are other teaching models apart from inquiry, but what does the OECD do? And then groups like McKinsey, the OECD actually said, oh look, we're going to interview some students after the 2015 tests and ask them about inquiry. Now, their understanding of inquiry, that it was in the laboratory led by the teacher, so it was narrow enough, but they came up with these 9 findings. They said, you know, inquiry, that's what we've found out. McKinsey came along and they said, right, here are these 9 findings and we know what the PISA scores are for these countries. We're going to link them together. And here they came up with their great finding. There are 2 dominant types of teaching practices. The first is teacher-directed, in which the teacher explains and demonstrates ideas, considers questions and leads classroom discussions. The second is inquiry-based teaching, in which students are given a more prominent role in their own learning, for example, by developing their own hypotheses and experiments. We analysed the PISA results to understand the relative impact of each of these practices. In all 5 regions, when teachers took the lead, scores were generally higher, and the more inquiry-based learning, lower the scores. I wish I had the time to unpick that, because it's honestly absolute shite. But and I'll finish by saying that my last step was, so they were blockages in, I was going to talk about another one. What cultures will enable change? And some of you will have heard me talk about a culture of research and inquiry, which I think in the new contemporary world is fundamental. And then a set of characteristics which are all contained in the Statement on Public Education, which is hidden away somewhere, which can be used, which are things like an ethical and social just culture, a democratic culture, collaborative and community-based culture, and a culture of diversity and cohesion, and an innovative culture. All of those things they're nice sounding, but they all have implications for how we work in a system and in schools. So in summary then, the elements of a new educational narrative for me are purposes, principles and values, and a process which enables an ongoing evaluation of curriculum and pedagogy, including an identification of the blockages to agreed change and recognition of the cultures and environment needed to support and sustain the kind of curriculum and pedagogy agreed upon. I believe that if a system did something like that and had educators at centre stage really engaging those questions, that system would indeed be a world-class system. Thanks very much.